This morning we have words of encouragement from Sensei, Father Michael Holleran. Please, Michael.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Michael.
So this past Saturday, last week, I gave an all-day retreat up at the Passionist Retreat House in Connecticut, where Roshi also works at times, on Bernadette Roberts. And I've been speaking about her in my Zendo Dragon's Eye the past few weeks as well. Bernadette Roberts is someone no one's ever heard of. She was a Carmelite in her early years, then left and became a wife and mothered 4 kids. She became an educator. So very ordinary, which is, of course, the big open secret, the gateless gate, just the ordinary. But that's also why no one's ever heard of her. According to Thomas Keating, the Trappist abbot and founder of centering prayer practice, she was the greatest mystical writer since John of the Cross. She passed away 5 years ago, but that's quite high praise. And her main thesis is that beyond what the great mystics like John of the Cross and St. Teresa speak of, the mystical marriage, the union, perfect union of the soul with God, the relative and the absolute together like that, there's a further stage called no self, which nobody talked about. And that's why Thomas Keating said she was the greatest mystical writer since John of the Cross, since nobody talked about it. And her book is called The Experience of No Self, and there are a number of other books too, but that's the one I was using, The Experience of No Self. So experience of no self. Every time someone hears that title, she says they think I'm a Buddhist. But she's adamant that her inspiration is purely Western, purely Christian, purely Catholic, in fact. And she doesn't have much use for, no self as a metaphysical proposition, the self in Hinduism or no self in Buddhism. She's speaking purely from the level of experience, from within another cultural context. And again, that's of course this very, very Zen way to approach it. What's the actual experience? That's why I was surprised when I discovered in one of her books that she commented on the ox herding pictures. I said, where'd that come from? And it seems that I saw in the acknowledgments of one of her books that she considered Nancy Baker, Mujo, a sensei in our lineage, one of her close friends. And she said that even though Mujo was an Anglican originally, she felt that her Zen training helped her to understand what Bernadette was talking about when she said no self. So Mujo and I had a Zoom conversation. We talked about it. We both agreed that if you look at her commentary, at Bernadette's commentary on the ox herding pictures, she doesn't get it. She takes it as the search of God for the soul rather than a person for their true nature. So she's not on the wavelength at all. But if you go further on to the very end, I think you'll find that she does rejoin the insight there. So we'll come to that. But let's see what she means by the experience of no self. And I think there's a lot there that we can really, learn from and identify with. I'll be quoting from a couple of the passages here in her book. But her main idea is that all the faculties disappear. They're yourself. Think about it. Myself is my self-consciousness and my ideas and my subject-object relationships with the world. So my consciousness, first of all, of myself, or my consciousness of an object. She says that all disappears. So there's no subject-object. There's no subject anymore. You as your ordinary consciousness. And that's what we mean by ourself, my self-consciousness and everything that flows from that. She also says there's no more will. Our will, which we rightly and often identify with ourself, the will is no longer operative. Our will is no longer the source of our actions. And all the affective baggage that goes with that sense of physical presence and power and thrust and all the affective baggage that goes with that disappears. So that's why, of course, she says there's no more virtue, and of course Zen and Rumi and others affirm that as well. There's no more virtue because there's no more will. There's no more self to do a virtuous act. So there's no virtue, and of course, as Roshi often says, there's no merit, because there's no virtue. There's no self. Well, so what is there? I mean, it sounds pretty scary. And of course, she says that too. She says often people, when they hear this, they get scared. So she just says, well, fear is a function of yourself, so when yourself disappears, you won't be afraid anyway. Don't worry about it. But this is what she, what she says about, well, you know, what does remain, or what this actually feels like. She says, we cling to the affective system out of fear of what life would be like without it. We're afraid that without feelings, we will be inhuman, cold, insensitive, robot-like creatures, so detached from this world that we might as well be dead. Needless to say, she says, or I think it is needful to say, there's no truth to this view. To explain what life is like without this system is basically impossible. It can only be lived and not understood. All that need be said is that what remains is a dynamic, intense state of taking care of whatever arises in the now moment. There could be no better description of Zen experience than that. But she's saying, from a whole different tradition, she says that it's a dynamic, intense state of taking care of whatever arises in the now moment. It's a continuous waking state. Wake up, right? A continuous waking state in which the physical organism remains unsensitive, responsive, totally unimpaired. When fully adjusted to the dimension of no self, nothing is found to be missing or wanting. So physical perception remains, but it's not the self that's having it or doing it. She says in another part here, the unity of that, quotes, which remains when there is no union, no self and no God for the self, because that disappears too, no God, and because that's correlative to God, so no self and no God. Here, no energies are forthcoming to go outward. Instead, there only remains the intensity of act, pure doing, the act of sheer living, the living of a nature so intelligent as to be incomprehensible and inaccessible to the mind. It's way beyond mind, the mind. That's why there's no mind, only Buddha mind. So there only remains the intensity of act, pure doing. This is like Wu Wei in no doing in Taoism. In fact, the Page-a-Day calendar today has that very thing from the Tao does nothing. There's no agent, there's no actor, there's no doer, and no done. There's just doing, pure act. But everything gets done. Wu Wei, no action, yet everything gets done. And the irony is that that's exactly the way scholastic theology and Aristotle and St. Thomas described God, described the absolute reality. Pure act. Pure act. So almost ironically, that philosophical idea fits in very well with this. So the faculties, though, as distinct, are not operative anymore. In another essay, she tears down most of Western theology in just a few lines. You know, she's all this debate about, you know, whether we're images of God because we have a mind and intelligence, or whether we're images of God because we have a will. As the Franciscans and the Dominicans argued all about this. And she says, we're idolaters if we think God has an intellect or a will. God has no faculties. God doesn't have any of that. God is no thing, she says. It's nothing. You can't conceive of it. And so if we're made in the image of God, we're nothing too. In the end, we're not our faculties, you know. Intellect, will, none of that. That falls by the wayside. So get over it. It's just the pure act. And you know, it's quite amazing. She says in another place that her eldest son, she doesn't speak much about her kids, but she does say this, that she feels that, you know, you're going to be swallowed up in sameness. You know, if you lose all these faculties, what's left? But she says, you know, we may be all formed from the same type, it does not subtract from the variety of form or its unique nature. On the contrary, sameness and difference, one and many, unique is the itself, the uniqueness and very essence of God and all that exists. So that's why in Zen you can say, well, what's Buddha? Well, it's the tree right there. It's 6 pounds of hemp. It's just this. And losing self, or being totally connected to God that has everything that is, as she says. Theologians, she said, would never understand like the mystics would. God is everything that exists. You can look around and see that doesn't suppress form at all. It's still there. And your sense perception, it's not your sense perception anymore. It's pure sense perception. But it's there. And then she says very wryly, this alone tells us that the self cannot possibly account for our individuality and uniqueness. It's not our self that's individual or unique that remains, but there's still individuality and uniqueness. We have only to look, she says, at nature, to see that the trees, the clouds, the animals, they don't have self. And yet they're the very essence of uniqueness, variety, and differentiation. Self does not constitute true individuality because this essential uniqueness remains when self is gone. And think about it, animals don't have a self. Sometimes we say, oh, the poor animals, they're not self-conscious, as we are. Well, don't be too jealous. That can be an advantage, And just imagine we can't even imagine how connected they feel to everything. Who knows what their experience is? And that's what she says a little bit later here. She says, without self, the sensory system obviously remains, for us and for animals and for whomever. And who can imagine the knowing to which that is privy, she says. And of course, in Zen experience, we realize what the experience to which is privy is that it's everything, totally connected. No self, no separation. It's unimaginable. So she says, to conclude this chapter on self, outside our choosing and doing, all being is moved by an unknowable intelligence, moved in one sure direction, evolution is right there, and changing as it goes, wherein the immediate goal is nothing more than the movement itself. Thus we move in and out of a variety of dimensions, different ways of knowing and being, always changing, always moving, and this movement is our delight, our revelation, and our very life. In this passage, we encounter much that is beautiful and awesome, but as each step unfolds, we let go of the present and move into the new without clinging. I mean, she might as well be a Buddhist with this language. We move into the new without clinging to what is past. In the effort to go against the flow, we hold on to our insights, ideas, experiences, thinking each one is the last, only to discover that we must move on, taking nothing with us. At one point in this journey, self comes forth, so there's a reason for it, contributes what it can give, and then fades forever beyond reach. Self then is part of this movement, the part through which all must pass, and the only aspect of the movement for which we are responsible. But just as everything must change, the self, too, eventually disintegrates and dissolves into nothingness. The only thing we know that never changes or passes away is the movement itself. In the last paragraph, as I see it, a contemplative is one who is aware of this movement. At first, she strives to go with it, but later, and this is going into no self, later, discovering she is being moved without effort, she abandons herself to become part of it, one with it, until finally she realizes she has never been anything other than this movement itself. God is everything. You want to use the word. We are too. And it's just that movement itself. So how does this connect with the ox herding pictures, right? So, in the eighth one, we just have the circle, where this is the mystical marriage, I would say, where God and soul, absolute relative are one. They're just non-dual. They're together, perfectly united, already prefigured in the seventh picture where you just have the herdsman left and no separate God. It's all there within. It's all in your experience. But that's not the end. The ninth picture is, and Roshi even calls it this in his book, no self. Wow. There's neither God nor self. Neither, or as one of the great Zen masters puts it from Japan, Shinichi Isumatsu, the world, formless and boundless, nothing, no self, and no Buddha. And what does that look like? What does that look like? You see what it looks like on the cover, the 9th picture. It's just reality. It doesn't suppress the trees or the animals or individuality. It just suppresses the self. There's no more self, no more Buddha to be relative to the self. It's just reality, pure, dynamic moments of everything that is right now. And that's fantastic. If you actually see what the commentary is on that picture, it actually says, nothing is better than to be as blind and as deaf. Boundlessly flows the river, just as it flows. Just, in other words, the movement. Everything is just real, just the movement, as Bernadette says. And most wonderfully of all, that goes right into the 10th picture, of course, which is just being compassionate service. The bare chest and coming into the marketplace without performing miracles, where the withered tree blooms. Bernadette describes this ultimate reality as the smile in a couple of places. Not a smiler or a smiled at, just smile. And here it's described as a huge laugh streams over his cheeks. All spontaneous. That's the very flavor of reality itself. The huge laugh. And it's just a tree. I'm reminded of Dogen's famous statement in the beginning, there are mountains and rivers, and then later when you get enlightened, they just disappear. But in the end, there's just mountains and rivers. Just that. Just this. That you can experience right here and now. And no, you can't experience it. It's just experience. No self anymore. It's just experience with a capital E. So I'm going to close with, I'm going to go back to Thomas Keating, who I mentioned in the beginning, who was a great connoisseur of Bernadette, because he experienced this in his own evolution, as is clear from his final poems, which I think have just been published. I'm just going to quote a few lines from his very last poems before he died a couple of years ago in his 90s. And you'll see very clearly from the poems that he's reached this point that we're talking about here. He says, I am as one turned inside out. And there's nothing there. Not you, capital U, God. Not you and not me. If this is union, there is neither two in one, nor one without another. It just doesn't apply anymore. Or another one where he says, when there is no more me, myself, or mine, in other words, no more self, only I am remains. Then the I may fall away, leaving just am. Just reality. And in the conclusion of another poem, he says, all words disappear into it with a capital I. And all creation awakens to the delight of just being, capital B. And finally, the last poem. It's only 3 lines, 1 sentence. Only the divine matters. And because the divine matters, everything matters. So you see, God is everything. In other words, God is everything that is, according to Bernadette, and only the divine matters, therefore. But because that's true, nothing else is suppressed, everything else is affirmed, because only the divine matters, everything matters. And that's why you go out, you go out into the marketplace to do compassionate service, but it's not you doing it. Nobody's walking when you're walking, there's just walking. Nobody's serving when you're serving, it's just serving. It's just being. But that's the great liberation. Everything matters. And you're everything. Because everything is God. And that's who you are. Nothing but the Buddha.